Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Iran's involvement in conflicts around the world. They are planning and playing a game of power, and they are winning, and they're winning well. Iran is involved in conflicts all over the world. In some conflicts, they are major players, up front and center, and pulling all the strings. In others, their role is less prominent. And in still others, they operate behind the smoke screens, behind diplomatic and walls and mirrors. And so it's important for us to focus a little bit on what Iran is doing. Because when we think of Iran and conflict, we actually think of Syria and Yemen and Iraq. They come to mind immediately. But they are merely the most prominent locales. If we as Americans and as Westerners care about freedom and safety, we need to look farther in order to see what Iran is doing, because their influence is in a lot of places. The United States must pay attention to what's happening right now in this tiny region called Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh, remember that name. It's situated in the Caucasus. Armenia captured the region from Azerbaijan in 1993. In the area, which is important, it's a place most of us have never heard of and can barely pronounce. It is in international dispute since 1993. Under normal circumstances, that would not even be an issue, just an interesting digression. The issue here, though, and central and compelling, is that satellite images are actually detecting numerous Iranian trucks and supplies delivering material to the region. The significance of this is not that Iran is playing a role and taking a side. The significance is that actually Iran is switching sides. That's important. For years, the Iranians were extremely friendly with Azerbaijan, which means that they supported them diplomatically and advised them militarily and helped them. Now Iran is siding with Armenia. What's happening? Iran shares the Caspian Sea with Azerbaijan, as well as with Russia, and several stands. The stands are clear. What are the stands? I'm speaking of stands like Uzbekistan, Uzbek, Kazakh, Turkmenistan. Okay, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, the stands we call them. The Caspian Sea is a misnomer. It's the largest lake in the world. It runs 700 feet deep, 640 miles long, and 270 miles wide. It's also filled with natural resources, especially natural gas and oil. The United States does not and should not want to change any sense of the status quo in the Caspian Sea. That is critical. Now, what's the big deal? Iran offered to mediate the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. They want to play a central role, and they want to be the leader in the Muslim world in general and in the area, specifically in this part of the world. It should also be clear that a conflict over this could easily erupt, drawing both Russia and Turkey into the maelstrom. Iran calls the coverage of their presence in the area, these trucks and supplies, fake news. But too many sources are showing images and discussing Iran's presence there. So it is, without a doubt, more than a rumor or hearsay. What we're seeing right now is important because it's probably happening very covertly, and there are weapons that Iran is shipping to the Armenians. Iran is also on the move, extending their reach and advancing their relations with Armenia. They also, if this is allowed to go on, Armenia will be breaking the United Nations and United States sanctions against Iran. Up until now, Armenia has had exceptional relations with the United States. That's Armenia. Once the United States wakes up and sees what's happening, and for all our sakes, I hope it happens soon, that relationship between the United States and Armenia will be finished. The United States does not take kindly to friendly relations with Iran. Washington must respond. Iran is patiently acting and watching, quietly acting and watching. If they detect no response from the United States, Iran will continue to push the envelope, acting and watching. They will become more and more bold. Their action will become more and more audacious. In addition, by the United States, that is, This is de facto a relinquishing of control of the area. This area of Nagorno-Karabakh, they will actually relinquish it to Iran. It might be small and far away, but the area is far too strategic to be relinquished to Iran. Russia realizes it, and that's why they're involved. They were livid when Armenia took the land and called it a land grab intended to alter the status quo on the ground. As a diplomatic rule of thumb, when Russia and Iran are involved in something, the United States must also get involved. Both Russia and Iran have perfected the art of destabilizing areas. Both Russia and Iran are always sending advisors into areas in order to destabilize the arena. It's important for us to realize that, because without it, we don't understand what's going on. Iran is not siding with the Armenians over the Azerbaijanians out of ideological support for ancestral Caucasus. Instead, Iran is there to expand Iranian reach, power, and influence, and diplomatically speaking, to stick it to the United States. The White House has other concerns right now. I realize that. A lot is happening around the world and at home. COVID-19 is one example. Economic crisis, another. Presidential elections are just a few months away. All of these are serious concerns. But this is important. If the United States permits Iran to have their way in the Caucasus, it will lead to an Iranian foothold in Europe. Shouldn't Europe get involved? Certainly. But the United States is bolder and stronger and more of a global conscience. Russia, meanwhile, has no conscience. Russia is involved because of oil and power. But they're especially involved because this area is in their backyard. Remember, they also abut the Caspian Sea. It's not too late for the United States to step in, but soon it will be. Another item that I've been thinking about actually has to do with the notion that this John Bolton's new book, and it's a preoccupation of almost everyone in the United States right now and around the world. Actually, when you focus around the world, it's remarkable how many people are focusing on this new book. With his flowing mustache and bushy white hair, John Bolton has always captured media attention. So recently, it was what he said. That's what captured the attention. Now, the attention of the former United States ambassador to the United Nations and former national security advisor is garnering attention about what he wrote. Everyone wishes they could be a fly on the wall in the White House. There's no question about that, especially in this White House, the Trump White House. And in his newly released book, Bolton offered just that, a fly on the wall's perspective. The promise of a tell-all account of how the Trump White House functions, or in this case, dysfunctions, had everyone talking about the Bolton book. Everyone was looking forward to a peek into the inner workings of the White House. Everyone, that is, except for the man who lives there. He did not want to see that. The White House, of course, tried to squash the publication of the book. Anyone who knows anything about President Donald J. Trump would know that. The response was so predictable. Bolton could have written the episode as a final chapter. What he couldn't have done, and what he couldn't have known, was that in this round, one, Trump's war against the publication of Bolton's book, Trump would lose. His attempt to stop the book from reaching the waiting hands and eyes of America and the world failed. U.S. District Court Judge Royce Lamberth ruled against Trump and the White House and would not grant an injunction stopping the distribution of the book entitled The Room Where It Happened. Judge Lamberth denied the injunction, saying it was too late to stop something that was already in the hands of the press, and advance copies were already out there. Lamberth reasoned, and this is a quote from the ruling, while Bolton's unilateral conduct raises grave national security questions, the government has not established that an injunction is an appropriate remedy. He continues to say, in taking it upon himself to publish his book without securing final approval from national intelligence authorities, Bolton may indeed have caused the country irreparable harm. He continues, but in the internet age, even a handful of copies in circulation could irrevocably destroy confidentiality. A single dedicated individual with a book in hand could publish its contents far and wide from his local coffee shop with hundreds of thousands of copies around the globe. Many in newsrooms, the damage is done. There is no restoring the status quo. He's right. the judge is absolutely right. The book is out there. It can't be stopped by an injunction, so it's senseless to issue one. Judge Lamberth took it a step further when he offered the Trump administration advice on how they could still damper the book, because Bolton did not wait until the final letter from the NSC came in saying that there's no classified information in the book. Judge Lamberth suggests that John Bolton may have broken the law. He suggests that Bolton, who once upon a time was the trusted protector of the nation in an often hostile United Nations, actually endangered the United States by publishing his tell-all. And if that can be proven, the book may be out there, but in the end, he just might not reap any of its profits. Cynicism aside, who writes a book, especially a book promising real-life drama and sensationalism, without an eye towards a significant revenue that will be brought in? Lamberth writes, and this is a quote again from the ruling, "This was Bolton's bet. If he is right and the book does not contain classified information, he keeps the upside mentioned above. But if he is wrong, he stands to lose his profits from the book deal, exposes himself to criminal liability, and imperils national security. Bolton is wrong," unquote. That's from the judge. Now, that's an important element. That's remarkable. The truth is that books of this genre seldom do what they promise to be. Once they're out and read and reviewed, the hype and the buzz has dissipated. They're often disappointing. This one is disappointing. I've read enough excerpts of the room where it happened to be able to say that if these are the steamiest and most damning sections Bolton has to offer, the book is a real letdown. Bolton was National Security Advisor to President Trump. He was the third, and he served from April 2018 until September 2019. From the start, it was not an ideal position for Bolton, period. The person whispering into the ear of the president is not supposed to be a controversial figure like Bolton is. It is a position that requires sage wisdom and measured commentary, all discreetly handled and behind the scenes. But that was not John Bolton, and I think his view on Israel is correct, by the way, and I'm 100% in favor of how he views Israel because he loves Israel, and it's genuine. And I liked that he was always straightforward and honest about his analysis. Honesty is important in your analysis. But that is exactly why he was not well suited for the White House position. John Bolton does not have an edit function. He aired issues in public that should have been handled in private. And then he decided to write a book and make it even more public. It's a shame, and it's a sham. And right now, it looks like the court battle over the book will be much more interesting than anything written in the book itself. Coming up, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column from the Wall Street Journal. It appeared online on June 14, 2020, and in print June 15, 2020. It's entitled Anti-Semitism and the Intellectuals, and it's penned by Cynthia Ozick. Now, Cynthia Ozick is one of a kind. She is one of the only female writers, authors, novelists, essayists who totally loves Judaism and Israel. Her tone says it all. She loves Judaism and embraces it. She is not a radical liberal. She is a centrist, which, by the way, others would call a rabid right-wing extremist. Ozick is insightful and probing. She is not left of center. She is not right of center. She is a centrist. She's also a family friend, and I want that to be clear also. She was very close with my father-in-law, Rabbi Dean David Mirsky. Even before I entered the family, I was a big fan of Cynthia Ozick. Her short story, Critique of Jewish Education and the Rabbinate, in a story called The Pagan Rabbi, which actually is a book, it's actually bound as an essay, resounds literally for me years after the first time I read it in undergraduate school. This column in the Wall Street Journal is a probing critique of intellectual anti-Semitism. Ozick begins with a wonderful description of George Eliot, the female author of The Spectacular Defense of Jewish Life and Jewish Nationalism, which later was called Zionism. That is Eliot, she had to take a man's name because no one would read a woman. So George Eliot is actually a woman. Eliot, was so powerful in their presentation of the cause that a street in Jerusalem is actually named after her. Ozick begins. George Eliot was at the peak of her renown in 1874 when John Blackwood, her publisher, learned that she was at work on Daniel Derona, a new novel. As a literary man, he was in thrall to her genius. As a businessman, with an instinct for the market, he valued her passionately dedicated readership. But an early look at portions of her manuscript astonished and appalled him. Too much of it was steeped in sympathetic evocations of Jews, Judaism, and what was the beginning to be known as Zionism. Now, Ozick explains the mistake so many people are making in thinking that anti-Semitism is of thugs. It's not. They're intellectuals. There are a lot of intellectuals involved in this anti-Semitism of today, and she explains it here. Here's how she says it. All of this off-putting alien erudition struck him as certain to be more than merely unpopular. It was personally tasteless. It went against the grain of English sensibility. It was an offense to the reigning political temperament. It was, in our notorious idiom, politically incorrect. Blackwood was unquestionably a member of England's gentlemanly intellectual elite. In recoiling from Eliot's theme, he showed himself to be that historically commonplace figure, an intellectual anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism is generally thought of as brutish, the mentality of mobs, the work of the ignorant, the poorly schooled, the gutter roughnecks, the torch carriers. But these are only the servants, not the savants, of anti-Semitism. Mobs execute, intellectuals promulgate. Thugs have furies, intellectuals have causes. Ozick is brilliant in the way she explains this. She goes on to explain that those who profess these ideas are part of the intelligentsia, not the rabble and uneducated fools. She writes, sophisticated terms such as boycott, divestment, and sanctions, designed to weaken and dismantle the Jewish state, are touted by superior pronouncements of university professors, members of Congress, aspiring politicians, respected journalists who have forsworn impartiality and for advocacy and other pinnacles of societal influence. Ozick concludes, writing that these anti-Semites are extremely dangerous, and these are her words specifically. Anti-Semitism dressed in the sheep's clothing of social justice is the province of elevated pitchmen, cultivated elites, learned professors, scholarly theorists. Intersectionality, a muddled and half-mystical credo that turns disparities into parities and distinctions into connections, is the coinage of Kimberly Crenshaw, a leading professor of law at UCLA and Columbia. Its faithful adherents populate academic organizations such as the American Studies Association, the National Women's Studies Association, the Critical Ethnic Studies Association, by surrendering to the doctrine of identity politics, the birth mother of intersectionality. These groups have allowed themselves to become venues of anti-Semitic incitement, and it's sad, I must say. On the lowest rung of this hierarchy of ethnic worthiness, Jews are designated as white oppressors of marginal peoples. They are accused of complicity in a colonialist plot against Palestinians and as accomplices in the training of police brutality. If they profess to be liberals or radicals of the left, they are shunted aside as persecutors of the weak. Even as they are scorned as unfairly privileged, they are treated as campus pariahs. Marxism is a movement of deluded. Anti-Semitism is a movement of the cleverest. When students become inquisitors and administrators are feeble, when the elect succumb to political haters, so will a nation's conscience. A vengeful mob is a fearsome thing, but the true monsters are its teachers. What a beautifully written and very powerful critique. It's a little long at the end, and I admit that. It's a little long as an essay, but it is filled with substance and understanding of this anti-Semitism that's emerging by the intellectuals. Second up is a column from Politico dated May 27th, 2020, entitled How Israel and the Arab World Are Making Peace Without a Peace Deal. The subtitle is Turns out that solving this Palestinian question isn't essential after all. And the Trump administration, Israel, and a few of the Gulf Arabs seem fine with that. It was written by Aaron David Miller. Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and the former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator, actually, Middle East negotiator for both Republicans and Democratic administrations. Miller begins. Without much fanfare or notice, the first known commercial aircraft of the United Arab Emirates recently landed at Israel's Ben Gurion airport. It was carrying COVID-19 supplies for the Palestinian Authority, which, out of pique, rejected them. As unprecedented as the flight was, it really shouldn't have come as a surprise. For the past 5 years, contacts between Israel and the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, have been booming. The examples of what amounts to a great thaw in an otherwise frozen political landscape are plentiful. Aaron David Miller is watching the progress being made between Arab countries and Israel. Despite the lack of a peace deal, he concludes with his assessment that it isn't peace, but it is progress, and this is how he writes it up. As for Netanyahu, as long as he doesn't expect too much from his new Arab friends and doesn't break the bank by annexing wholesale the Jordan Valley and the whole West Bank, very unlikely, the Gulf Arabs will stay on board, as they did when the United States Embassy opened in Jerusalem. It ain't peace, but then again, that was never in the cards. In a broken, angry, dysfunctional Middle East, who could ask for more? Coming up next, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to discuss 3 cartoons today. The first 2 are by A.F. Branco from a site called Legal Insurrection. The first is dated 6/11, that is June 11th, 2020. A woman in her house is on the phone with 911 as someone is breaking into her home. You see the arm holding the crowbar and breaking the window and turning the handle of the door. The emergency dispatcher says, "You have reached the new and improved 911. For psychological help, press 1. For a social worker, press 2. This is obviously critique of the move to defund the police department. Second up is a cartoon about blame. The question is, who was to blame for COVID-19? Who was to blame for coronavirus? For the answer, you see China and the mainstream press pointing at Donald Trump. That's funny. Finally, this is from Powerline Blog, one of my favorite sites on this question, dated June 20th, 2020. There's a photo of Mandy Patinkin from the movie Princess Bride. On the top of the picture are the words anti-fascist. At the bottom is a quote from the movie. "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." For those who never fell in love with this movie as I did, in the movie Princess Bride, the word that's misunderstood or he's speaking about is the word inconceivable. The point here is that Antifa, anti-fascists, right? Anti-fascists who call themselves anti-fascists are not that at all. They're anarchists and revolutionary Marxists. That's who they really are. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Iran announced that they have tested a new type of cruise missile, a missile that is resistant to electronic hacking. Official Iranian media covered the test and reported that the missile hit its targets in the Gulf of Oman and in the Indian Ocean at a distance of 280 kilometers. That's 170 miles. According to the report, 2 different types of missiles were tested. If all this is true, and I'm not certain it is true, Iran has a hack-resistant missile. They are a major step ahead of the West, if that's true. A cruise missile concept is a smart bomb with an adjustable homing device. The best defense against a cruise missile is to jam the electronics or to fry them. It's easier to fry them than to jam them. Jamming requires the defense system to first have a transmission of exactly the frequency of the missile itself. Frying destroys all electronics in the area, and that's easy. According to other reports, you should know that the Jordanian Prime Minister, whose name is Ayman Safadi, embarked on an emergency helicopter flight to Ramallah recently to speak with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Now, it's obvious the topic under consideration and discussion was Israel's annexation of the West Bank. It is not known exactly what the conclusions were, but it is this much we certainly know. King Abdullah of Jordan has said annexation could mean an end to Jordanian peace treaty with Israel. That might be an exaggeration, but there's no doubt that there will be a cooling off of relations between Jordan and Israel if annexation takes place. Israel's new defense minister, Benny Gantz, received a briefing on Iranian nuclear development. And according to sources, which were published in the Hebrew press, Israel's defense intelligence predicts that Iran will have the components necessary for a bomb within the next 6 months. And then they will be on their way to assembling the bomb, which will take them less than 2 years. That's a big deal. So we're literally on the cusp of an Iranian bomb right now. In Israel, even billionaires must quarantine. If not, even they will be caught and immediately deported. That's what happened to Brandon Korf, a 30-something billionaire, son of Sherry Redstone, grandson of Sumner Redstone of CBS Viacom fame. Brandon was allowed into Israel on an appeal. No non-Israelis are allowed in. And anyone who comes in, any Israeli who comes in, has to isolate for 14 days. Brandon came in on an appeal to visit his brother, who's a lone soldier in the IDF. But almost immediately after arrival, he went to visit his girlfriend, Yael Shelbia Cohen, a 19-year-old Israeli actress model, who's also serving in the IDF. Well, he was caught, and indeed, he was deported. It's as simple as that. So a billionaire also gets deported from Israel. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. I mentioned Marxism. It's worth explaining that there was a trio in Marx's original inner circle. They were Marx, Engels, whom everyone knows, of course, and then there was Moses Hess. Hess was expelled by Marx because Hess believed that the revolution would happen naturally, and Marx believed that violence was essential to the Marxian credo. Marx called Hess a utopian socialist. It meant he was unrealistic. Hess became a Zionist and wrote one of the great treatises about Jewish nationalism called Rome and Jerusalem. It went mostly unnoticed, but Herzl read it and found it. After Herzl read it, Rome and Jerusalem, he wrote, and I'm quoting here from Herzl, "Since Spinoza, Jury had no bigger thinker than this forgotten Moses Hess." Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.